What would happen if all of the ice in the world melted? As climate change escalates, you may find yourself wondering what a world without polar ice caps and glaciers would look like. Would you survive? And for that matter, would any humans survive? Where would the surviving people live? What would our planet look like? There are so many questions that arise when considering what might happen in a world without ice. Many science fiction movies and media have imagined what would happen if Earth was under such extreme conditions. You might be surprised to learn that even sci-fi's most apocalyptic predictions may pale in comparison to the reality of what would happen in the hypothetical where all the ice caps all melted overnight. In this video, we'll explore what conditions would cause all the ice in the world to melt, what all of the melting ice would do to the planet, society, and land as we know it, and who would survive. Let's let our imaginations run wild for a minute and consider what impacts we and the Earth would experience if all the world's ice caps and glaciers melted. One question we first have to explore is where the world's ice is located. One source of the ice is the polar ice caps. The polar ice caps are the massive layers of ice and snow that cover much of the Earth's lands, including Antarctica, Greenland, and parts of Canada and Russia. Eastern Antarctica is home to the largest ice sheet on the planet, while Greenland, West Antarctica, and other areas covered in the ice sheets are relatively smaller. In Antarctica, there is both an east and a west ice sheet. The East Antarctica ice sheet contains 4/5 of the ice on the planet, which has survived many periods of global planetary temperature changes. The eastern ice sheet holds water vapor that falls as snow on the eastern side of the continent. But if the planet returns to a climate like that of the Eocene epoch, which was the second of 5 epochs in the Tertiary period, it's unlikely that the eastern ice sheet will survive. In West Antarctica, there is a smaller sheet that was especially vulnerable to warmer climates. This sheet sits on bedrock that's below sea level, and as water beneath the ice sheet grows warmer, the ice sheet is slowly melting from below and is collapsing. Between 1992 and 2013, the ice sheet lost an average of 65 million metric tons of ice each year. Another source of the ice is glaciers in the Arctic. Glaciers are big chunks of ice that are created from the accumulation of snow over a long period of time. Glaciers are created in places with exceedingly low temperatures, like places at sea level and especially in high-altitude places like the mountaintops. As the temperature rises, glacier melting occurs, which has historically caused extreme flooding in the past and the loss of biodiversity in some places. You might be curious, thinking, well, how much ice is there in the world anyways? There is currently an estimated 5 million cubic miles of ice on our planet, so there would be an unthinkable amount of ice melt in this hypothetical situation we're exploring today. As you may be able to imagine, the consequences of the world's ice, that is, all 5 million cubic miles of it melting overnight, would be equally insurmountable and catastrophic, as we'll soon see. Though the conditions needed for all the world's ice to melt are unlikely to happen so quickly in reality, you might be wondering, what would actually happen if the world's ice all melted at once? What would happen to our planet and natural environment? Let's take a look and see. One of the biggest impacts of a global melting of polar ice and glaciers would be flooding. Because ice doesn't just melt, but instead flows down valleys like rivers, the flooding patterns depend greatly on the geological landscape of given places. Therefore, some parts of the planet would be more impacted by the flooding than others. We'll look more into where the most flooding would take place later on in this video. The projected rise in sea level in a world where ice caps and glaciers all melted would be significant, to say the least. If all our remaining ice melted overnight, sea levels would rise a projected 216 feet, which would especially impact coastal communities like Australia, where 80% of its population lives close to the coastline. But where exactly would all the water go? If all of Antarctica's ice was to melt, the global sea level would rise about 58 meters. If Greenland's ice was to melt as well, it would contribute another 7.4 meters, bringing the total to 65.4 meters, or roughly the equivalent of a 21-story tall building. While much more water would reach many parts of the globe as a result of the melting, that doesn't mean that everywhere on Earth will be wetter. In fact, some places may actually experience increased drought and dryness. It may seem counterintuitive, but more water in the world would lead to less in certain parts of the world. Without the ice caps to reflect sunlight, the average global temperatures would likely rise, causing increased droughts, especially in parts of Africa like Sahel and the Horn of Africa. Droughts would most likely lead to famine, disease, conflict, and devastation for many countries that survived the initial flooding. And with the lack of ice caps and glaciers to reflect the incoming solar radiation that warms the planet, our planet would only grow increasingly hot and dry for the foreseeable future after all the ice first melted. Beyond the rising sea levels, so much water introduced into the oceans would also cause more unpredictable weather patterns worldwide, with drier, arid regions seeing more heavy rainfall and wetter places becoming drier. At the same time, sea levels rising may also result in more powerful storm surges, which would cause even more flooding in coastal areas that were not submerged initially. It may be hard to imagine the devastation that would all be caused by the melting of ice sheets and glaciers, but the impacts are undeniable. As a result of all the environmental harms experienced by places all over the world's biodiversity would also struggle to survive after all the ice caps and glaciers in the world melted. Many animals would go extinct following the rise in sea levels. One such species would likely be the polar bear, most of which largely depend on sea and glacial ice for survival. As many polar bears are killed by the melting of ice caps happening presently with climate change, glacial ice in some regions may generally be experiencing slower melting, which allows their species to survive. However, if all the world's ice suddenly melted, polar bears would lack habitats and hunting platforms, causing their probable extinction. You may be surprised to find that the extinctions would also likely include many marine species as a result of changing currents, decreased salinity levels, and other ocean impacts. Though some species may be able to adapt, the melting of the world's ice would be a global, cataclysmic mass extinction that would irreversibly alter our planet's biodiversity and life on Earth. So, let's get to one of the biggest questions surrounding all of the ice melting. Where would the water go, and what parts of the world would still be above ground? What other changes might happen as a result of the flooding? With all the flooding and sea level rise that would happen, many places would look different on our planet. In fact, many places would develop new seas, inlets, and other water bodies that don't currently actually exist. In Australia, for one, much of the dry and dusty outback would likely become a massive inland sea, similar to the landlocked ocean that existed in the region millions of years ago. As a result, many existing towns and wildlife would be flooded and left underwater, devastating the biodiversity and the people living there. You may also be surprised to learn that the melting of ice may also have impacts on the rotation of the Earth. The length of the day might actually change as a result of the melting ice flowing into the ocean. The ice sheets are located close to the Earth's axis of rotation, and as the melted ice moves away from the axis of rotation and into the ocean, the Earth would begin to spin slower. Eventually, the Earth may spin for as much as 10 to 20 seconds longer each day as a result of this phenomenon. However, if the meltwater remains close to the source, such as in a glacial lake, there would be no net movement of mass away from the glacier or ice sheet, which would mean the Earth's rotation would not change significantly. Therefore, it's hard to predict how much the Earth's rotation could change as a result of the melting ice. Already, however, we are seeing today that there are already shifts in the Earth's axis of rotation since the 1990s. The geographic north and south poles of our planet are the points at which the Earth's axis of rotation intersects. But those poles are not fixed, and they shift depending on where on the planet mass is distributed. Historically, it's only been natural factors like ocean currents and the convection of magma that contributed to the shifting of the Earth's axis of rotation. But as the planet has begun to experience the loss of hundreds of billions of tons of ice each year due to climate change, the poles have begun to move as a result of anthropogenic impacts. Research shows that the average speed of polar drift from 1995 to 2020 was 17 times faster than in the years between 1981 to 1995. This means that since 1980, the poles have moved 4 meters in distance. This phenomenon might not seem all that significant, but a change in the Earth's spin demonstrates just how far-reaching the impacts of the melted ice would be in our hypothetical. So we have an idea on how it would affect the Earth, but how would it affect us humans? The planet may look very different as a result of so much melted ice flowing into the ocean and overtaking much of our continents. So where on Earth would be destroyed by the ice melt and where would be spared? Let's take a closer look at what our world would look like if all the ice caps and glaciers melted overnight. As the sea levels rise, entire cities, states, and even countries would be washed away. Many of the largest cities on Earth would become uninhabitable, totally submerged like the fictional Atlantis. Cities including San Diego, Seattle, New York, Boston, and Miami would all totally be submerged underwater, as well as the entire state of Florida. Not only that, but many major cities worldwide with particularly dense populations would be destroyed, including Istanbul, Barcelona, London, Venice, and Copenhagen, to name a few. Further, only a few major inland cities and national capitals would survive, including Moscow, Canberra, and New Delhi. Not only would cities and states be submerged underwater, but entire countries would also be swallowed by the ocean. Small nation islands like the Maldives, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the Bahamas would all be eradicated by the melting of the whole world's ice. Larger countries like Bangladesh, which lies particularly close to sea level, would become part of the Bay of Bengal, and the windmills of the Netherlands would find themselves on the ocean's floor. Denmark's Julian Peninsula would become an island, though most of the rest of the country would vanish. The places that don't succumb to the initial flooding and sea level rise will not be much better off. One major concern for those countries which survive is water access. Ironically enough, even though all the world's ice will become water, its runoff into the ocean and the subsequent flooding of many continents and islands will actually contaminate the groundwater. As the sea level rises, many groundwater reserves located further inland will inevitably become infiltrated by saltwater from the sea. Wells may become contaminated, irrigation will become impossible, and people will lack access to not only water, but food too. All of this would further threaten the livelihoods of millions of people who survived the initial melting of the ice. Even those who live far inland could be impacted by salinated water, which means that our freshwater supply of drinking water and water for agriculture and irrigation would be contaminated with salt, rendering it unusable. The costs of desalinating the water would be exorbitant, especially considering the energy and resources that desalination takes. Clearly, many communities would be highly impacted by lack of access to clean drinking water as a result of the sudden melting of all the ice on the planet. Further beyond the salination of groundwater, the mass melting of ice would also release toxic chemicals into our waters and communities. Included in the chemicals stored in the ice sheets and some mountain glaciers, in the Himalayas for instance, are chemicals like DDT. DDT is also known as dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, which was made famous by Rachel Carson's 1962 book called Silent Spring. These harmful chemicals and radioactive material in the ice could be released into rivers and drinking water and cause serious health concerns. Now you might be wondering, how on earth did chemicals and radioactive materials end up in these massive amounts of ice? Over the years, there have been many instances during which military bases and other institutions have disposed of toxic chemicals in unpopulated places in the Arctic. For instance, during the Cold War, there was a military base located in northern Greenland called Camp Century, where the military dumped many toxic chemicals and radioactive materials in the region and abandoned the base. As the ice melts, the chemicals and waste could be exposed and wreak havoc on the communities that it reaches, potentially creating serious health concerns for many places exposed to such flooding. All of this points to serious threats to health and safety that would arise following the melting of ice for places worldwide. It may seem like everywhere on Earth may become less habitable. This may not be the case, though. Though much livable land would be lost by fully melted ice caps and glaciers, the rise in sea levels would cause Antarctica to likely become habitable. The continent may emerge from its icy covering and would become an archipelago. Though the land would be arid and hard to live on, it may become more habitable for humans compared to its currently extreme and harsh environment. Changes in habitability may also surface in terms of food availability globally. Places like China may become less fertile and drier, suffering drought and famine, while places that become more habitable, like eastern Russia, may become fertile for farming. Changing food production and availability will likely impact our global agricultural trade patterns as the climate changes. But what would all of this look like on the map? What kinds of places might survive the melting of all the world's ice? As we learned earlier, presently inhabitable places like Antarctica may become more habitable as a result of melting ice and warming global temperatures. In North America, the entire Atlantic seaboard would vanish, as well as Florida and the Gulf Coast, in this hypothetical mass melting of ice. Large-scale changes in climate, weather, and rainfall may also cause once fertile land to become infertile. This may prompt mass famine, destruction, and warfare as a result. In California, the hills of San Francisco would transform into islands, and the Central Valley would become a bay. Inland cities and countries with high elevation, like Denver, Colorado, may be likely to survive. Given how massive North America is, with significant amounts of land far from coastal areas that would be the most impacted by the rising sea levels and flooding, some parts of North America may be less affected by the sudden melting. But how would the rest of the world fare in response to this global catastrophe? Further south, many parts of South America would be subjected to significant incursions of the increased water and rising seas, where Atlantic inlets would form in the Amazon and Paraguay basins. With the formation of these inlets, a lot of biodiversity in South America would experience devastating flooding and destruction, as would Argentina's capital, Buenos Aires, and Uruguay's Montevideo, which would be underwater as the sea rushed inland. Much of the South American coastline would wash away, including the lovely Rio beaches in Brazil. Mountainous regions along the Caribbean coast and in Central America may also survive the flooding. Clearly, Central and South America would look very different than it does today in the case of mass melting of all the world's ice. Though Africa may lose less of its landmass to the catastrophic rise in sea levels than in other parts of the world, the rising global temperatures and drought may make Africa uninhabitable in the end. The Mediterranean Sea would encroach upon parts of Egypt as a result of the rising sea levels. Many parts of Africa would also be washed away, like Senegal, and Egypt's pyramids becoming oddly geometric islands. Africa may fare better in terms of flooding than in many other places worldwide, but the drought and conflict that may arise as a result may cause further complications for the continent. In Asia, more than 600 million people living in China would be displaced by flooding, as would all of Bangladesh along with coastal India. In Cambodia, the Mekong Delta may grow, turning the Cardamom Mountains into an island. Clearly, Asia will likely experience serious flooding, as so many Asian countries have large coastlines or are island nations. Further, in Europe, the Adriatic Sea and the Mediterranean Sea will both have encroached upon many island and coastal countries, including the United Kingdom, Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark, and other European countries. With this drastic change, it would undoubtedly upset the world order. Let's see what might happen. The social and political impacts of ice melting worldwide would be astronomical, with so many refugees, colonization of inhabitable land, and further global chaos. What could we expect to happen to our governments and society as we know it? Because so many countries and major cities would be submerged underwater, the number of people displaced would be far greater than ever before. Every part of the planet would be impacted in some way by the sudden melting of the ice caps, whether impacted by the rising temperatures, the rising sea levels, mass flooding, destruction, or extreme weather. Countries around the world would have impacted infrastructure, homes, environments, and more. At the same time, the huge amounts of refugees seeking shelter, food, and a safe place to live would put a massive strain on the cities and countries that survived the rising sea levels. These countries may not be able to accept more refugees, as such strained conditions could be conducive to anarchy, upheaval, and complete transformation of borders, national identities, and our world's geographical makeup. The fact that some previously uninhabitable places like Antarctica in the world would become habitable as a result of the ice melt indicates conflicts over control over habitable land may emerge. Colonization of the region may ensue, whether people would seek to move to Antarctica or to drill and mine for newly accessible resources. People wouldn't be the only ones taking root in Antarctica following the melting of all the world's ice, including Antarctica's ice sheets. The grassy tundra beneath Antarctica's ice could one day be the site of new ecosystems and biodiversity. Currently, the biodiversity of Antarctica is limited to its plankton-rich southern ocean and in small areas of ice-free coastal land. The continent today may not be as barren as you might anticipate, with about 110 native species of moss and 2 flowering plants, the Antarctic hairgrass and pearlwort. As ice caps and glaciers recede into the peninsula region of Antarctica, native land plants and animals have already begun to flourish with the more easily accessible freshwater and milder temperatures. Populations have already begun to grow, occupying more land and increasing at faster rates, though the extreme physical environment of most of Antarctica is limiting. As temperatures rise, however, the land may become more vulnerable to non-native and invasive species, as some native species thrive in the colder climate. Because the native polar species are particularly suited for survival in cold climates, they lack many other evolutionarily advantageous traits that non-native species may have, which could introduce a competitive natural environment threatening Antarctica's existing biodiversity. Currently, this change is gradual and progressive, but one day, Antarctica as we know it could look entirely different from the cold, harsh, snowy climate we imagine today. Now, imagine this all happening at an escalated rate. The rapid, detrimental colonization of invasive species in Antarctica could radically shift life in the South Pole, and as humans compete for land and resources, the results could be disastrous. As you can probably tell, the environmental impacts of all the world's ice melting would likely lead to global chaos. The disruptions to agriculture and manufacturing, as well as the economic collapse and destruction of infrastructure, all caused by the melting of the ice caps and glaciers, would cause a sense of disarray. War is likely to break out over the world's remaining resources and land. Governments would likely fall, national borders would likely crumble, and starvation, extreme heat, and health concerns may all emerge. Now, with all of these likely impacts, who would survive? It's clear that millions of people would likely succumb to the environmental devastation and global chaos, but some more than others. The melting of the planet's ice caps and glaciers would cause displacement and high risk of death or severe injury for the 40% of the world's population that live within 250 feet of the high tide line. People living in island countries would also be among the first to be displaced or killed by the flooding. Those with the money, technology, and space to move and adapt to a completely changed world would have the best chance of long-term survival. Go figure. Access to resources may largely depend on whether a country's technology, major infrastructure, and cities are devastated in the initial onslaught of flooding and coastal destruction. People living inland in temperate climates with ample access to clean water would likely have the best shot at survival. Greenland and Antarctica may both be refuges, but their capacity to take in millions of refugees would be limited. Much of Greenland is below sea level, but the large ring of mountains around the country may keep out the rising sea levels. In Antarctica, some humans could settle, but the geology of the continent resembles that of the Andes Mountains, which is not necessarily conducive to housing millions of people. We now know that most people on the planet would be severely impacted by the melting of all the world's ice, but what about the damages caused by all of the ice caps and glaciers of the world melting? How much money would that cost? One estimate suggests that the costs associated with the destruction caused by sea level rise would be $1 trillion per meter of sea level rise, which means that the sea level rise of all the world's ice melting would result in an estimated $66 trillion. That doesn't even count the costs of human lives, destroyed infrastructure and resources, and the economic disruption which would occur worldwide. Clearly, the costs of so much ice melting overnight is hard to quantify, with such vast and widespread impacts that would be felt worldwide. You might be wondering, what would need to happen for the Earth to lose all of its ice? It's not unusual for Arctic ice to melt and break off glaciers in a process called calving. However, for this to happen all at once, the global conditions would have to be pretty extreme. Scientists have done research on what level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would be needed to cause Antarctica's ice sheet to completely melt. The upper range of the Antarctic ice sheet's stability is estimated to be somewhere between 500 and 800 parts per million of carbon dioxide. If we reach that point, the planet would be on a trajectory of being completely ice-free for thousands of years. However, the high concentrations of carbon dioxide and high global temperatures needed for all the ice in the world to melt overnight are near impossible. As we know from earlier, it's common for Arctic ice to melt and break off from glaciers. But how likely is it that this nightmare scenario of total ice melt would actually happen? Currently, the rate of melting and ice breaking off is outpacing the production of new snow and ice. At its current rate, the polar ice caps will take more than a century to melt. One estimate projects that the melting of the ice caps could theoretically transform the Earth by 2121, but it will likely take thousands and thousands of years to reach the drastic levels discussed so far in this video. In fact, some scientists estimate that it would take more than 5,000 years for the ice to totally melt. Is there a chance we could have all the world's ice melt in a short period of time? We know that the point at which the Antarctic ice sheet would reach its threshold is between 500 and 800 parts per million of carbon dioxide. But how close to that are we? Currently, the Earth's level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is around 415 parts per million. Each year, the planetary average levels of carbon dioxide has been increasing at a rate of between 2 and 3 parts per million each year. Our CO2 levels may sound alarmingly close to that 500 parts per million threshold, but even so, you probably don't need to worry about the nightmarish hypothetical of all the world's ice melting overnight. Although it is possible that we'll reach the 500 parts per million threshold in the coming century, the 2100s, if trends in harmful fossil fuel emissions continue, it would likely take thousands of years for all of the world's ice to fully melt, giving us time to adapt to the changing planet. But our hypothetical isn't about what would happen if the Earth's ice melted over thousands of years. We're exploring what would happen if the world's ice melted overnight, which is very unlikely to happen based on the data. Clearly, the likelihood of all 5 million cubic miles of ice on Earth melting overnight may be unlikely, but this fun hypothetical pondering what could happen if all the world's ice melted may be an indication of what kinds of harm may result as climate change accelerates. Many ice caps and glaciers have been melting as our global temperatures and carbon dioxide levels rise. Though we won't feel all the effects overnight, many people have already been displaced or impacted by increasing flooding, sea level rise, drought, tropical storms, and other impacts of climate change. The harms described in this hypothetical can be a reality for many people worldwide, even if the timing or scope might be less drastic. Displacement, death, drought, sea level rise, and even entire countries underwater, along with glaciers and ice caps melting, are all unfortunate realities in our world today. There's reason for hope, even so. Our generation has the power to either reverse the growing emissions and climate change, or else allow our planet to follow on the path to becoming a world without ice. As we look ahead, recalling how severe a loss of all our world's ice would be can help us to prevent and prepare for rising sea levels resulting from climate change in our world. Thanks for watching, and take care.